Ambassador Ingrid Tersman, who is a strong friend of our institute and of this whole initiative, who in a way represents regional cooperation, since she is ambassador to several CAMCA countries, including one across the sea, across the Caspian Sea. She's ambassador to Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, who will provide us with some experiences of the relevance of Nordic cooperation for this region. Hiroyuki Akita is a senior staff writer for Nikkei Asian Review. He's a second-time participant, at least, in the CAMCA conference. We're glad to have you again to share some experiences from Asian cooperation. And we have two members of our network who will conclude it. Roman Vakulchuk, who is, and I see now there is a strong Scandinavian domination of the discussion here, since he is currently based in Oslo as a senior fellow a researcher at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Unfortunately, Gulia Kolakova, who was going to provide us with the trip report from the CAMCA Network's trip to Singapore, was unable to make it to Tashkent, and therefore our friend Ravshan Sobirzoda, who was also on the trip, has very graciously accepted to take her place and to do that report in lieu of that. So without further ado, I hope we can stick to 5 to 7 minutes so that we have a little bit of time left for a discussion. Ambassador Kurbanov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cornell, and dear friends, dear colleagues. Today, due to a new regional policy of Uzbekistan, a regional rapprochement process have been launched in Central Asia, focused on building constructive and mutually beneficial relations with its neighbors. In 2018, at the initiative of the President of Uzbekistan, the first consultative meeting of the heads of states of Central Asia was held in Astana, which can become a platform coordination of approaches on current issues of regional security and development. A number of major international conferences were held on finding mutually acceptable solutions to regional problems, political settlement in Afghanistan, working out specific measures to develop the transport and transit potential of the region, and others. Special attention is paid to creating favorable conditions for the development of regional trade, enhancing investment activities, direct contacts between businessmen and business association of the countries of the region. Last March, for the first time, was convened the Central Asian Economic Forum at the level of vice premiers of Central Asian countries. In the first development of the emerging process of regional rapprochement, in our opinion, the following principal points should be considered. First of all, sustainable development of regional cooperation in Central Asia is possible on the basis of first, open regionalism, second, maintaining geopolitical balance, third, interaction within the framework of existing mechanisms and institutions of international cooperation in the region. The most important imperatives are, first, strengthening the political will of the countries of the region towards a sustainable rapprochement. Second, building consensus on key priorities for regional development. And third, the development of effective mechanisms and institutions of international cooperation in the region. Promotion of regional rapprochement should be based on the recognition of the need to further strengthen the sovereignty and independence of each country in the region. Second, resolve the problems of socio-economic development. Third, modernize regional economies and integrate them into the system of international cooperation. And the last, improve their external image. It must be emphasized that the Central Asian interaction does not imply the creation of new organization with any supranational bodies. Our main goal is the formation of workable and efficient mechanisms of interaction, the creation of an effective dialogue platform on the most pressing regional issues. Despite the progress achieved, many systemic issues of developing regional cooperation still remain unresolved. The low level of intra-regional trade, the serious problems of diversifying the economies of the countries of the region, and their foreign trade and investment relations, the competitive nature of the transport and logistic strategies of some Central Asian states, the remaining unresolved issues of border and water settlement. All these requires careful development of integrated joint solutions at the multilateral level, the development of the most appropriate model and practical mechanisms for regional interaction and coordination. The model of regional interaction in Central Asia should be developed, agreed upon, and implemented by the countries of the region themselves, based on the conditions of the region, using the most appropriate international experience. In our opinion, the following questions are particularly relevant at this stage. First of all, building sustainable mechanism for political dialogue and interstate cooperation. This could be done on the basis of consultative meetings of the heads of Central Asian states, which should become regular. The agenda should include the most pressing regional issues, and we should gradually improve their practical effectiveness. Preparation of these consultative meetings and more effective bilateral and multilateral coordination between the summits will require the establishment of appropriate coordination mechanisms. The existing system of consultation between ministries of foreign affairs can be used. Last year, a special meeting of the foreign ministers of the 5 countries of the region was successfully held in Bishkek, at which issues of regional interaction were discussed. This practice may well be continued. An important area of multilateral cooperation that requires regional solution may be improving the ecology of the Aral Sea region and addressing climate changes, maybe in the framework of the International Fund for Saving the Aral Sea. The development of intra-regional connectivity can be another driver for regional coordination and interaction. A regional trade facilitation program can be a good start. And the creation of cross-border zones and development corridors, industrial and agricultural clusters can become an important mechanism of interaction to modernize agricultural sector, industry and services. Recently, for example, the ADB proposed to create an economic corridor Shymkent, Tashkent, Khujand. Since all these projects and programs require financial and investment support, the urgent task is to develop the financial component of regional cooperation, as well as coordinate efforts to improve the investment climate of the 5 countries and the region as a whole. Third, an important task is to create a favorable environment for regional cooperation. This requires strengthening foreign policy coordination, cooperation in attracting support and resources from key global and regional partners, multilateral banks, and development institutions. Problems in addressing the challenges of modernizing the economies of the region and developing regional cooperation, ensuring financial and technical support by the United Nations and its development institutions, donor countries, multilateral development banks, and private capital will be crucial. To this end, it becomes necessary to have an appropriate mechanism for the financial interaction of the regional countries with global partners. For instance, a mechanism of financial dialogue for Central Asia and Afghanistan could be established. For the development of optimal and effective mechanism for multilateral cooperation in Central Asia, an applied analysis of regional cooperation models in other regions of the world can be of practical importance. In this regard, these sections of CAMCA 2019 in Tashkent is of great interest. We hope that in the speeches of other participants of our panel there will be many good suggestions for solving the above-mentioned problems and challenges of regional cooperation in Central Asia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kurbanov. Ambassador Tersman, the floor is yours.
Dr. Cornell, thank you so much. Friends, colleagues, it's really great to be back in Tashkent and also to once again talk about Nordic cooperation and regional cooperation. To dive straight into our materia, we have a motto among the Nordic countries, stronger together. And I'm sure you know that separately the Nordic countries are very small, but together we are 27 million citizens, and we are the world's 10th largest economy. One of the reasons for that is the good cooperation that we have among each other. I would like to give you a few factors that make Nordic cooperation unique, and I will focus on 7. There are many others, but for the sake of keeping it short, I will do that. Nordic cooperation is one of the world's oldest regional partnership. It started in 1952. I know that Mercosur would argue that they are older, but I think we can contest that. Our cooperation has its roots in politics, economics, in history, in culture, and in common values. And we focus on areas where we believe cooperation brings added value for the countries and for our people. The second factor is that each country's sovereignty and independence is respected in Nordic cooperation. Denmark, Iceland, and Norway, they are members of NATO. Finland and Sweden are militarily non-aligned. Denmark, Finland, and Sweden are members of the European Union. Iceland and Norway are not EU members, but through the European Economic Area, Iceland and Norway cooperate very closely with us and are economically integrated. Finland and Sweden are among the most active of NATO's partner countries. I think it is important to say that all the cooperation that we have among ourselves is fully compatible with other relations that each country has. If this would not be the case, Nordic cooperation would not be so successful, and it would not have such strong support. Third, Nordic cooperation is based on intergovernmental cooperation that you mentioned, Ambassador Kurbanov. It does not hinder self-determination or does not prevent countries from choosing different solutions to problems that they are experiencing. Concrete examples which may be of interest to the CAMCA countries when you are thinking of how to cooperate on common issues are things that we have developed over time. We have a passport union that we established in 1957. We have an integrated labor market established in 1967. Common social rights, so you can get your pensions no matter in what country that you live, for example, and also education and healthcare assistance. We have a Nordic language convention, and we have a common education market, and also, for example, joint efforts to combat tax evasion. I think these are examples of what we call Nordic synergies, where we are stronger together than on our own. Sixth, Nordic cooperation is a matter of political will. We do have formal agreements among ourselves, and we have well-functioning institutions, but the political will is the key driving force. And anyone who is given national responsibility in the Nordic countries, also regionally, locally, and in political parties, they quickly become part of a Nordic network of people with corresponding responsibilities in other Nordic countries. So that goes, for example, for all ministries, like mine, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. At practically every level, you have a Nordic context, from ministers down to desk officers. And that means that practically anyone working in any ministry in the Nordic countries is exposed to Nordic issues and to your colleagues from the other countries on a very regular basis. That means that they follow you throughout your career. So now I'm kind of coming to the end of my career, but I have many, many colleagues who I met over 30 years of service in Nordic settings and through my ministry, and that's quite a treasure, I have to say, and quite a gift. 7, the Nordic countries have shared institutions, and I think they constitute a backbone to why this also works so well, in addition to the political will and the public support. We have 2 overarching components. One is the parliamentary cooperation, which is called the Nordic Council. That was established in 1952. Then we have the intergovernmental cooperation through the Nordic Council of Ministers, and that was established in 1971. And chairmanships rotate annually among the 5 countries, and not the same country chairs both institutions. In every country, it's the prime ministers that have ultimate responsibility for Nordic cooperation, but often there is a specific minister appointed to work on Nordic issues. In our case, in this government, it is our Minister for Foreign Trade. And we have a division in the Foreign Ministry that coordinates this cooperation among others, and that is the same in the other Nordic countries. So this is the basic setup. I would be happy to answer any questions. And I'm glad to see that there is such considerable interest in Central Asia to explore and to learn from other cooperation forms. The Nordic, I believe, is a good example also to Central Asia, as it offers ways of cooperation and leaving each country's independence and sovereignty intact. It does not interfere with any other form of cooperation. It does not compete. It is not against anyone. It is all about cooperation where there are the most benefits for the citizens. And I think that requires, that is a good setup for a region that is so dynamic as Central Asia and the CAMCA region is now. And I think the region would clearly benefit from sound regional cooperation, and we from the Nordic countries, we are ready to share our experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we move from the northwest to the northeast, if you will, from the Central Asian perspective. Mr. Akita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here in Tashkent. I've already learning a lot about Tashkent, especially taste of beers and the taste of wine of Tashkent. But I need more time to go around the city to learn more about the culture. But anyway, to be serious, maybe I'll start with my conclusion. I think that the ASEAN framework, actually, as a journalist, I've been a journalist for 30 years, and I've been covering ASEAN related to conferences many, many times. And I should say ASEAN regional cooperation is basically talk shop, just talk and talk. But my conclusion is that ASEAN regional cooperation is more relevant to Central Asia because of 3 reasons. One is that geopolitical location. ASEAN is surrounded by great power, which are hostile each other. Now, US naval presence, so US and China, and potentially India, and Russia is also active in Pacific. And secondly, no country have a strong security alliances with great power. I know that the Central Asian country have some kind of security cooperation with Russia, but not like a very, very strong alliance. And thirdly, ASEAN and Central Asian countries members have totally different variety type of political system. Vietnam is one-party system under communist regime, and Indonesia is a totally, I would say, democratic country, and Singapore is a soft authoritarian. They have an election, but every time they choose one party. So there are a variety of systems. So in that circumstance, ASEAN Regional Cooperation have 3 characteristics. First, they, as I said, they talk and talk, but they try not to integrate too fast. Every time, as a journalist, I get irritated because every year they set a goal, like a 2015, they will set up community, but I don't see any strong community has been established yet. But they say, we will do it. And also, their principle is non-interference to a domestic politics. Of course, Vietnam is a one-party country, communist country, while Indonesia is a democratic country. So once they started to talk about each other, it will collapse. So they never interfere. And thirdly, consensus-based, without any, authority like a EU Parliament or EU committee. There aren't any such body at all. They just gather and discuss, and only on a consensus basis, they slowly make agreement and then make a progress. So it's a talk shop. But the purpose is to, and they also play golf together after the conference, typically. So purpose is to overcome the difference of the political system and also overcome distrust and then unite psychologically and also, politically. They try to unite. So this is the one characteristic. And secondly, but it doesn't mean that they would not, they have not produced any result, especially in economic area. It is easy, it is mutually beneficial. So it is easy for them to make a progress. So now they have already abolished more than 99% of tariff among the ASEAN. And also, I don't go into a detail, but they are lowering the barriers for service trade. And also they have largely liberalized the foreign direct investment for each other. So it's kind of like a very quite, in the economic sense, they are highly integrated economic community, trade, entity. And also they sign FTA, free trade agreement, with China and Japan and Australia and New Zealand. So economically they are, uniting, and also they are reaching out to the other country. Then thirdly, and most importantly, political regional cooperation. That is, one characteristic is that they try to get together, and then as ASEAN, they try to negotiate with big power, especially with like China. One example is South China Sea issue. Maybe you may know that there is a dispute over the sea territory of South China Sea. And only Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia, Philippines, only 4 countries out of 10 have a dispute with China. But ASEAN always discuss about this and come to some kind of like a common consensus. A rule of law, no intervention, and solution through the dialogue, those kind of ambiguous but important principle. And then ASEAN collectively tried to engage dialogue, not negotiation necessarily, but the dialogue with China. China, of course, wants to always try to demand bilateral negotiation with Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines. But those countries always say it is an issue of ASEAN as a whole. So ASEAN, under the framework of ASEAN and China dialogue, they discuss. It didn't produce any good result, but recently it started to make a progress. China eventually agreed to negotiate, kind of like a code of conduct, kind of principle on the South China Sea issue with ASEAN. So now, instead of negotiating bilaterally with China. ASEAN as a whole is negotiating with China on this issue. So my conclusion is that, So my conclusion is that in that respect, Central Asia is surrounded by both Russia, who think that, I'm sorry to say that, but Russia think that this region is a sphere of influence, but at the same time, China is expanding its sphere of influence economically. So there is a great power competition over this. And it is very important for Central Asian countries to unite. In order to do that, maybe ASEAN way is to not to hasten, but get together, get along. I know that you have a different view, but and then unite in order to being divided by Russia. But still, last word is that still, depending on the geopolitical location, ASEAN is unfortunately gradually being divided by China. A country like, so maybe let's say red is a pro close to China. Red state is like a country like Cambodia, I would say, Laos, which is located near the China, and blue state closer to maybe US or far from China. That is maybe Indonesia or Vietnam and those countries. And in the middle, there is country like maritime ASEAN country like Indonesia. So they are being more and more divided. So it is becoming more and more difficult for them to come up with a very sharp statement criticizing China on the South China Sea. But still, they keep going and issue statements somehow every year. Anyway, thank you. I stop here.
Thank you very much, sir. Now we move to Roman. And Roman, you are going to provide us with some comparative analysis, I believe.
I hope so, to the extent that it will be built on also what the previous speaker said. And in my role, I will try to combine lessons from the two regions for the reason that, as Svante said, that I'm based at the moment in Norway, working there. But at the same time, in my work, we are increasingly working with countries of ASEAN and Central Asia. So hopefully there will be something that would allow me to compare three regions with each other, which is, of course, at the same time is a very challenging task. And first of all, I would like to agree and also disagree with Mr. Akita to the extent that he said that it's more relevant to look at the experience of ASEAN for Central Asia. I think it's true, and you basically raised this very important issue of similar foreign policy challenges and the presence of big powers around countries of two regions. At the same time, I think in many other areas, especially when it comes to to demographics, when it comes to issues of economic development, I think there's so much to learn from Scandinavian experience, from the sort of the Nordic countries. And for me, I personally think that demographics always plays a very important role. So we know that in ASEAN, the total population is around 600 million people. As Mr. Ambassador said, in the Nordic area, it's 27 million, right? And in Central Asia, it's around 72 million. So, of course, in that sense, looking sort of at the experience of Nordic countries is more relevant to the extent that if you look at the population density, is quite sparse in Scandinavia, and it's very similar in Central Asia. And I'm quite familiar that for some years, many international organizations were trying to implement the development model of Southeast Asia in Central Asia. But I think if you try to basically implement this model, which is based on very intensive economic coordination and also economic activities based on the very highly populated areas, because if you have a lot of people living in one small area, it means that it's very easy to facilitate cross-border trade, cross-border coordination, also infrastructure development and so on, also building an economic order. So this is less the case in countries like Central Asian countries, where you have very vast territories, highly unpopulated. Of course, in this sense, the infrastructure itself and only infrastructure cannot be seen as the solution to the economic problems and challenges that the region is facing, because you also need to add some other very important factors, which I think have to do foremost with the development of solar power potential, so like soft infrastructure development, so it's human resources, and this is also, I think, where Scandinavian experience comes very handy and very relevant, where you have like major investment coming to the human resources sector, because this would boost the economy, and this would also potentially then complement some of the big infrastructure projects that are now being completed in Central Asia. Also, I think in terms of what is interesting about the Nordic coordination is that in addition that it has intergovernmental system and format, it also have very strong focus on sort of the bottom-up approach. So it's like very much interaction and activities between civil society as well as between all other actors. So you don't need so much the government to help you to sort of foster integration and coordination between each other. And we know that in the mainstream discussion when it comes to Central Asia, often we hear the need that the governments should get together and try to arrange regional platforms and different sort of channels for communication, which is of course very important, but I think it's not really sufficient sort of criteria in order to move forward in terms of integration. So one also needs to promote a lot of different exchanges in terms of, for example, scientific coordination, in terms of tourism and so on. And for example, working in Norway, we have a couple of programs where during a year you have an opportunity to go and work and have a research stay in any other Nordic country for like from 2 weeks to 6 months. And this, of course, greatly facilitates the potential for joint projects. You also work together on joint publications as well as joint funding and so on. So this, of course, a very important factor. One particular aspect which makes Central Asia very different from the two regions in question, ASEAN and Scandinavia, is, of course, when we look at the economic players, we still have a very big dominance of big companies in Central Asia, compared to around 90% of contribution from small and medium-sized enterprises, both in ASEAN and Scandinavia, which is a very huge number, while in Central Asia, on average, the number is less than 40%. So you still have very important, big role of state-owned corporations and also like big private companies, which of course often do not serve as sort of the main driver for economic growth, which is actually the case in ASEAN and also in the Scandinavian countries. 2 more points to make. I think it's very relevant for Central Asia now to look at how institutions in countries like Sweden and Norway work, because I think that, well, when it comes to the quality of institutions, they are very strong and they have this particular capacity to anticipate different changes. One example, for example, you know about the Norwegian pension fund, which is the biggest today in the world, and it has capital of more than $1 trillion already, which is in the first place, of course, was based on the oil revenues. But today, I think there's this very strong understanding that with the ongoing issues of climate change, also with the fact that oil and gas resources and all fossil fuels may become soon stranded assets because of the very strict regulations as regard climate change. So there is a huge risk for fossil fuel exporters, because I mean, if there's very tight regulations at the global scale, it means that, well, the markets will be shrinked for potential imports of these fossil fuel resources. And so, of course, now the Norwegian pension fund is diversifying away from fossil fuel, which is quite a paradox, because it's built on the oil revenues, but now they withdrew from, for example, investment in the coal industry, in all its global investment, as well as also they have a discussion at the moment in Norway that there should be more movement away actually from oil and gas also in terms of their investment and capital. So, I mean, the institutions in Scandinavia have very strong anticipatory capacity, to predict change and to be better prepared, also both regionally as well as at the global scale. So this is also something to learn, because in Central Asia often the states and, let's say, governments and also private actors, they mainly react to the situation when it actually happens. So basically there's a kind of the reaction to what's happening at the moment, while the capacity to sort of anticipate potential change is very limited. And here's an example, for example, of China, where Central Asians often have to deal with the consequences of new actions and policies coming from China without being so much prepared and actually foreseeing sort of the new policies coming from the big neighbor, as you also said that it's also very important always to look at. And finally, I think also the point relates to the fact that in terms of the social policies, there's also much to learn from the Scandinavian experience. And also one of my prominent examples is that Nordic countries have managed to learn how not to, overburden their, for example, budget when it comes to the health policy. And we know that, well, Nordic countries are among the most healthiest nations in the world, if you look at the different rankings. And this is actually achieved not so much because of their, increased and excessive spending on the medicine and also on health, but rather because they just invest in sports. So they have very active social policy that sort of promotes doing different types of sports from the childhood. And if you look at the correlation, you see that the more you invest in sports and different sports activities, the more you subsidize this industry, the less you will spend over time on medical care, which is, I think, just an excellent example to look at. I think that's it, but I'll be happy to answer your questions later on. Thank you.
And now we move to the practical side. And Ravshan, tell us what your takeaways are from spending a week
Yeah, thank you very much.
deeply immersed in regional cooperation.
Yeah. So the design of the program, it's the basic design is if you're a Rumsfeld fellow, you're eligible for this program, and it's only 7 countries. It's Central Asia plus Mongolia and Afghanistan. So hopefully every year. So the first year was this year in February. We were the lucky ones who were selected and traveled to Singapore to actually learn about the ASEAN experience. Plus, it was not only ASEAN, but also we got a lot of experience from Singapore. So we met with a lot of experts who were not only from Singapore, but also were from Indonesia, from Thailand, and other countries of ASEAN economies, 10 ASEAN economies. Apart from that, we were lucky to meet with Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. We met also with Minister of Education and Minister of Economy. And there were also other top-notch officials, experts on the region. What the major takeaway most of us had from that ASEAN trip or study tour was that ASEAN, it's not only a platform where you share ideas, these 10 countries or 10 economies share ideas, but also it's a platform where everybody, every country, every individual country of ASEAN economy had the same power to take a decision, which was unique for me, per se, coming from Central Asian region. Thanks to Hiroyuki and Roman, who basically covered most of the ASEAN features, most of the ASEAN qualities. What most of our takeaways from that study tour, my takeaway was most of the successful ASEAN economies, they focused on several areas. They invested a lot in human capital. There is a rule of law that people actually follow. There is a good governance, a transparent system. And there is a conducive environment for private sector to actually function. There's a good level playing field for companies to be involved. There are actually opportunities for them to enter the market or leave the market same time. So everyone has equal opportunities. Finally, the key takeaways that I mentioned, plus Hiroyuki and Roman mentioned, and others, from these ASEAN economies, is they can be replicated in our economies, in CAMCA countries, if there is a political will, of course. Given there is a political will. As we all have the same shared interests and shared aspirations, as the CAMCA's main headline is saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have almost 15 minutes for a discussion, which is amazing. I don't think we have microphones in this room. We probably don't need them. Oh, we do. We have one here, maybe for posterity. Mr. Tulipov, please, you hand him the mic. Oop.
Thank you. I would like to address my question to Mr. Kurbanov. I'm curious about this, for me as an academic person, surprising change or surprising shift of rhetoric, political rhetoric, academic rhetoric from integration to cooperation. As a scholar who studies integration problematic since 1991, I may say that the entire period of independence from 1991 to approximately 2005, the overall communication cooperation within Central Asia was and can be evaluated or portrayed as normal integration process, including all related aspects of integration, such as institutionalization of integration. And now, from conference to conference, from paper to paper, I observe that the rhetoric is changing as if we are, let's say, afraid of the very notion of integration. How would you explain such a surprising shift of our rhetoric from integration to cooperation? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your question. It is indeed very important now. I should say that the level of regional cooperation is now so insufficient that even regional cooperation, genuine regional cooperation, will be a great progress for the region. Until now, despite newly activated, very active stance of Uzbekistan in regards to regional cooperation, there are still in some other countries of the region, they believe that this process is good if it won't be any mandatory or some rules which will be imposed on the governments of the countries of the region. And for example, we have some countries which are neutral one, and they don't they have a very good appetite for regional cooperation, but not for any imposing integrational structures in the region. So there are a lot of various kinds of impediments to even to speak now about integration. And by the way, our Western analytical partners also believe that it's at least it's too early to speak about integration, because integration, as Professor Starr used to say, smells of geopolitics. And that's why open regionalism, personally I believe, is a very good formula for current stage of regional interaction and coordination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Right over there.
Well, very well done presentations. Thank you. I would like rather raise a question about the component without which you cannot talk about decent integration, council, why the success of Nordic Council has done so fast and quick and so long lasting is the Nordic countries had a freedom of speech, which we are not talking here about at all. So these 5 countries, by Reporter Without Borders, Freedom of Press 2019, Uzbekistan 165th place out of 180 countries. Kazakhstan 158, Tajikistan 149, Kyrgyzstan 98, Turkmenistan 178. And all these countries are dependent on Russia, which has 149th place, and China 177, that's 3 from the last end. So before talking about any cooperation and further later on integration is a way higher level of cooperation. There should be first of all dialogue that brings to understanding. Only understanding brings to belief, trust, then cooperation comes. So we cannot pass all the stages and talk about these things today when we don't talk about the freedom of speech in each country. That's what it's about. Would you agree?
Who would like to try to answer that? Can you not cooperate until you improve the situation with regards to freedom of speech, or do you have to actually have a better form of regional cooperation which encourages regional economic development, which in turn can help you improve scores in the situation of freedom of speech? I think you could posit a counter-argument. Your argument is well taken. I think you could pose a counter-argument to that as well. So I'd like to hear from our panel. What would you say? Who would like to start? Yes, sir.
Yeah, since I'm a journalist, I feel an obligation to respond first. Yeah, so I totally agree with you that the freedom of speech and freedom of press is very, very important. But when we talk about the regional integration, especially experience in Asia, is that maybe opposite. Because if you wait until there is no distrust among ASEAN countries, it's non-starter. Because as I said, Vietnam is a communist state. And I'm sorry to say that, but I don't think that there is a freedom of speech in Vietnam. But Singapore, you visited, Singapore is an authoritarian regime, so limited space for freedom of speech. While Indonesia, you can say anything. So if you try to merge, if you try to get together all of these different political situations and wait until there is a kind of merge, I don't think you cannot start. So idea is, for me, pragmatic approach is to cooperate on a mutual beneficial area. I feel like I'm speaking, representing ASEAN leader, but the mutually beneficial area, mainly economic cooperation, trade and investment, and there is a more mobility of the people, then there is a kind of spread of a common value gradually. And for the barrier, political barrier, will get lower and lower. That is my understanding.
Thank you. So we're out of time, but I will take two final points. That is Farouk and Aziza, who were first. Sorry to everybody else. I think you can make your points later to the panelists. But 30 seconds each, please.
I just would like to draw your attention to what actually Ambassador Tersman mentioned, and I think it's very important. You've said when you were describing Nordic countries that Nordic countries as a region are a 10th economy in the world, and that's very important paradigm for us to learn. We've never referred to Central Asia as a common, even where we actually desperately need, because for competitiveness of the economy, we are not very interesting destination for investment as a country, as individual countries, but we could be much more interesting place to go and invest if we start talking as a region, and where we will start seeing each other as a partner, not a competitor. Because, for example, today to move goods in Germany is 4 times cheaper than in Central Asia. So we need connectivity, we need to have outreach to the markets, we need to be competitive and also predictable for everybody else. And I think if we start from a very pragmatic point of view, putting aside for the time being the freedom of speech with all due respect, but to really start with trade, with economic rationale, why we need to talk to each other. And I can give you one very good example. In the last 2 years, trade turnover between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan tripled. That's, I think, the best argument for whatever we call it, integration, cooperation. And I think where I would start with just notion of one region for economic purposes. then the rest will come. And as long as we are talking about ourselves as individual countries, I think it would be very difficult to put ourselves on the map. As a region, it's much easier. So the more the merrier. I'm all for Central Asian integration, cooperation, anything together.
Thank you very much. Farouk,
Svante, if you just, as a member, can I...
No, Farouk was before you, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Nazira. So I really liked how this panel progressed from ASEAN skepticism to ASEAN euphoria, and in the middle was Nordic admiration. So that's marvelous. But the most important thing, if you, in the interest of time, if you can name just one thing that we can learn from ASEAN and from Nordic Council, and most importantly, can apply and contextualize it within the Central Asian region, what that would be. Thank you.
You have 1 minute to think about that while Nazira makes her point.
Let's remember the motto of ASEAN. It's one vision, one identity, and one community. And I would like to add to Aziz's comment that at least let's consider the tourism. We don't travel to each other. We never have been, for example, we never travel even in Central Asia or Caucasus. With this program, we started traveling. And there is a trend in ASEAN. Even they have a special campaign, ASEAN Tourism, and it's developing and growing every year for 7.5%. And they have a trend like ASEAN backpackers. This is what they have achieved. Even if we, as a Central Asia region, will achieve this trend, that would be a huge benefit for the economy of these countries. Thank you.
I will take the privilege and take two. One is better functioning institutions, because that provides for trust in society. And second, people-to-people contact. Lots of that across the borders.
Just 15 seconds, 2 points. Wise, clever management of a great power relationship. And secondly, in order to handle great power relationship in a clever way, country have to unite. Not unite, country have to unite. And I think economic cooperation is best to unite at the initial stage.
For a question, Farouk, I think since I talked about both, I can make 2 points, right? The first one maybe from ASEAN, what we can learn from, I think it's very similar in terms of that if a region faces with many different issues, both internal and external ones, what you need is really slow cooperation and integration. And I think we shouldn't probably criticize ASEAN so much for that they don't move forward, because you really have to be very incremental just to make progress on this, when you have so many issues. And this is not the case in the Nordic countries, right? So that's one thing. I think it's good to move quite slow, but still steadily forward. As for the Nordic cooperation, I think what really can be seen as a low-hanging fruit is that since there's so much very simple but very intensive activities between, for example, businesses. And we know that businesses is very disintegrated in Central Asia. So why don't we create, for example, things like Kazakh-Uzbek Chamber of Commerce or Kazakh-Kyrgyz and so on and so forth? Because there's many such associations, for example, in Nordic, which hugely facilitate the interaction between the countries. So it's very simple. You don't need to, it's not rocket science, but you just need to implement it, right? And then you will be able to establish more links between the businesses, which as actually, as Isa said, is very important, so that countries see each other as one common entity and unit.
Anything from you, Ravshan?
I can add something. Aziza she hit the nail on the head when she said about the trade relation between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. It's about cooperation, it's about integration. And to respond to Farouk's question is, you remember during the meeting in Singapore, there was a sign, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was something like separately, united we win, or yes, united, what? Together we win, separately we fall, something like that. But the meaning is that united, if the region unites, there is more trade, there is more movement of people. So this way we actually, there's one of the ways to actually to develop economies, one of the panacea. So thanks.
Ambassador Kurbanov, you get the last word.
I must say that I thank you for all your proposals. And by the way, I was happy to hear from Mr. Akita about ASEAN's talking shop. It's very important indeed. We should, 5 countries, talk more to each other, more meetings of the heads of states, ministers, civil societies, the business circles, talk.
And play golf too.
Yeah. And the result will be in due course.
So in closing, before I urge you all to go and take a look at the networking expo out here. A few points of conclusion. The first is that I don't know which Central Asian presidents play golf, but they clearly have to learn. Or maybe they can find Buzkashi or something else to congregate around. Second, if you are, I hope also that this has been interesting for those of us or for our network and audience who are not from Central Asia but from the Caucasus. Unfortunately, regional cooperation there has a lot of more dimensions that are intractable, unfortunately, and I hope at some point we can reach the same level of discussion there as well. And finally, if you are interested in reading more about this issue, our institute published a Silk Road paper on this a few months ago on regional cooperation in Central Asia and the impetus towards it and foreign models, where both ASEAN, Nordic Council, Visegrad and Mercosur are discussed. And you can find it on the website of the Institute if you are interested. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their wisdom with us, and also for the audience for taking part in the discussion. Enjoy the networking expo right outside, and we will see you soon in another panel. Thank you.